The engines roared like thunder as the transport ship cut through the Atlantic waves. For the German women crowded in its hold nurses, clerks, radio operators, the rhythmic hum of the engines was both comforting and terrifying. Each thud of the propeller reminded them that they were moving farther and farther from home and deeper into the unknown. Most of them had never seen the ocean before. Now it surrounded them endlessly, gray, cold, and merciless. They were prisoners of war, captured after the collapse of the Reich, and shipped across the world to a land they had only heard of in propaganda films. America. What awaited them there? No one knew. The rumors ran wild among them. "They say the Americans treat prisoners well," whispered one. "Better than the Russians, at least." Another snorted. "Better? You mean they'll give us food before the firing squad?" The laughter that followed was bitter, hollow. Days later, the coastline appeared vast and green under a golden sun. The women crowded the deck, silent, as they glimpsed the American flag waving above the port. Everything looked impossibly large. The trucks, the cranes, even the men waiting on the docks. And then they saw them. The guards. Tall, broad-shouldered, faces sharp and sunburned, their uniforms crisp, their movements confident. To the women, exhausted and thin from months of travel, the Americans looked like giants. A few gasped quietly, others exchanged nervous glances. "They're enormous," one woman murmured under her breath. Another whispered back, "They're a lot bigger than we expected." It was half a joke, half a confession, but in that moment it broke something heavy, the suffocating silence of fear. A few women smiled, just barely. The guards didn't bark orders or point rifles. Instead, they motioned calmly, guiding the prisoners to waiting trucks. When one woman stumbled, a soldier instinctively reached out to steady her, then quickly stepped back, unsure if the gesture would offend. That single act, that brief flash of kindness, was enough to confuse everyone watching. Inside the trucks, as they drove toward the camp, the women stared out the windows. America didn't look like the monster they had been told it was. The roads were clean, the farms green, the air filled with birdsong. It was peaceful. Kira, one of the nurses, whispered softly in German, "Maybe this captivity won't be as cruel as we feared." Her friend, Elsa, gave a weak smile. "Just wait. We'll see how long their smiles last." But deep down, something had shifted. They had been prepared for punishment, for hatred for men who would remind them every day that they were the defeated. Instead, they found tall strangers who treated them with quiet respect. It was the first lesson America would teach them, that strength did not always mean cruelty, and that sometimes the enemy looked nothing like the monster they had imagined. The first days in the American POW camp were tense and quiet. The German women didn't know what to expect. They slept lightly, flinching at every sound, afraid that the kindness they saw upon arrival had only been an illusion. The camp itself was strangely orderly. Neat rows of wooden barracks surrounded by fences, a mess hall that smelled faintly of coffee, and guards who seemed more bored than cruel. Everything felt too calm, almost unreal, to those who had lived through the chaos of war. Each morning began with roll call. The women lined up in their worn gray uniforms while American guards read names from a clipboard. Most of the guards were huge, tall, broad-chested men with deep voices and serious faces. One morning, as they stood in formation under the rising sun, something unexpected happened. A gust of wind swept across the yard, blowing a few strands of hair into Kira's face. She brushed them aside and noticed one of the guards struggling to pronounce a long German name. His accent twisted it so badly that even the women couldn't help smirking. That's when one of them, a red-haired clerk named Marta, leaned toward her friend and whispered just loud enough for others to hear. "They're a lot bigger than we expected, but their tongues don't seem to work any better." For a moment, there was silence. Then, someone snorted, another giggled, and within seconds, the line of women who had been silent for days broke into muffled laughter. Even the guard looked up, confused, then realized he had become the joke. He raised an eyebrow, smiled slightly, and muttered something under his breath in English. The women didn't understand the words, but they caught the tone amusement, not anger. It was the first time the prisoners had laughed since their capture. A small sound, fragile but alive. That tiny spark of humor spread through the camp like wildfire. That evening, as they washed their clothes by the water barrels, the women retold the story again and again, exaggerating it, laughing harder each time. It was absurd, harmless, and human. For once, the camp didn't feel like a cage. The next day, one of the guards, the same man from roll call, passed by the laundry area. As he walked past, he called out in broken German, "Big, yes," and flexed his arm dramatically. The women burst into laughter again. Even the shy ones couldn't hide their smiles. That moment did something no order, no speech, no law could do. It broke the invisible wall between captor and captive. The fear that had frozen their hearts began to thaw, replaced by something softer. They still didn't trust these men. But they had seen something unexpected, a sense of humor, a touch of humanity. And in that laughter, the women found a strange kind of strength. The courage to be human again, even in captivity. For Kira, that morning would always stay in her memory. Because in that moment, surrounded by strangers and fences, she realized something simple yet profound. Even enemies can laugh the same. The days slowly began to blend together. Roll call, breakfast, chores, lights out. The rhythm of captivity was steady, predictable. Yet within that sameness, something had quietly changed. The guards and the women no longer looked at each other as faceless enemies. The laughter from that morning joke had left a trace, a small but lasting bridge of humanity. The German women started to notice things they hadn't seen before. How the guards carried crates of food to the kitchen without complaint. How they spoke softly to one another instead of shouting. How they treated wounded prisoners, not with contempt, but with a kind of steady professional care. Kira saw it most clearly one cold morning when a nurse from her barracks fainted during cleaning duty. Within moments, one of the guards, a tall man named Carter, dropped what he was doing and ran over. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the infirmary. His hands were massive, calloused, strong, yet when he set her down, his touch was as careful as a doctor's. The women watched from a distance, stunned. The same man who could probably lift a truck was treating a frail prisoner as if she were made of glass. Later that afternoon, when the nurse regained consciousness, she whispered weakly, "That guard, he carried me like a child." No one said anything for a while. They didn't know how to process it. Twilight, strength, and gentleness, together. It was the opposite of what they had been taught to expect. In Germany, they had seen what power looked like: boots, shouting, orders barked through fear. But here, in this strange American camp, power looked different. It was quieter, controlled, human. The next day, while serving food, Kira accidentally dropped a bowl of soup. The scalding liquid splashed across the floor and onto Carter's boots. She froze, bracing for the punishment she was sure would follow. Instead, the guard just sighed, crouched down, and handed her a towel. "No harm done," he said gently, his voice calm. She didn't understand all his words, but his tone said everything. As she wiped the floor, her hands trembling, she glanced up. He was smiling, not mockingly, not cruelly, but in reassurance. A small, human smile that made her eyes burn with tears she didn't expect. That night, she wrote in her tiny notebook one of the few personal items she still had: a single line in German. "The giants have gentle hands." It was the only way she could describe the strange contradiction she was witnessing every day. The Americans were bigger, louder, stronger, everything they had feared. And yet, somehow, they made the camp feel less like a prison and more like a pause between worlds. Kira realized then that the walls of the camp weren't the only barriers being tested. The invisible walls inside their minds, built from fear, hate, and propaganda, were beginning to crack. And through those cracks, for the first time, light was starting to get in. By late November, the camp's rhythm had softened. The once strict silence of the German women had been replaced by a strange new sound: laughter. It didn't come often, and it never lasted long, but when it did, it carried across the yard like something fragile, rediscovering itself. The Americans noticed it first. "They're not scared anymore," one guard murmured to another as they watched a group of women hanging laundry in the pale Texas sun. "No," his partner replied, "they're starting to live again." Among the women, humor became a quiet form of rebellion, not against the guards, but against despair. Frida, the youngest of them, had a knack for it. She could turn almost anything into a joke: the size of the guards' boots, the taste of American coffee, even the way their enormous uniforms looked on their small frames. "Perhaps they make everything large in America," she whispered once, as an enormous guard passed by. "Even their kindness." The others stifled their laughter, afraid of being overheard, but the guard, catching just enough of the tone, turned and smiled knowingly. It was too late to pretend they hadn't been caught. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Frida laughed first, and soon even the guard joined in. That small exchange broke something open. After that, the fear began to fade. One afternoon, Kira received a letter, the first since her capture. It was from her younger brother, written from a refugee camp in Austria. The words were brief, clumsy, filled with longing. He didn't know if their parents were alive. She sat on her bunk for hours, staring at the letter, her heart twisting with both hope and grief. When Carter, the tall guard who had carried the nurse weeks before, passed by on inspection, he noticed her tear-stained face. He hesitated: regulations discouraged personal contact, but then quietly set something on her bunk: an envelope and a pencil. "You can write back," he said softly. She looked up, startled, unsure if she'd heard correctly. He nodded toward the paper. "I'll make sure it gets through." That night, Kira wrote her first letter in months. Her handwriting shook, her English uncertain, but her heart poured out onto the page. When she handed the folded envelope to Carter the next morning, their eyes met for only a second, a brief, wordless exchange that carried more humanity than any speech could. Later that week, during work detail, the women began humming softly while folding laundry. Frida turned the humming into song, and before long, half the room joined her. The guards didn't stop them. One even tapped his fingers against the doorframe, keeping rhythm. For a moment, the walls disappeared. It didn't feel like captives and captors, just people sharing a small, fragile joy in a world gone mad. That night, Kara wrote another line in her notebook: "Laughter is not treason, it is survival." The war still raged far away, but inside Camp Huntsville, something far more powerful was happening. A quiet peace, built not on treaties or flags, but on understanding. One cold November morning, the German women awoke to laughter and the smell of food. The Americans were setting tables, roasting turkeys, and smiling. "Today, Thanksgiving," a guard announced. Cautiously, the women joined the feast. For a moment, they forgot the fences and the war. The food was warm, the air light with laughter. Frida joked, "Even their turkeys are bigger here." And everyone laughed, guards and prisoners alike. After the meal, Carter handed Kira a small photo, a sunset over golden fields. "To remember," he said simply. That night, Kira wrote in her notebook, "They treated us not as enemies, but as people." The barbed wire still stood, but something inside them had changed forever.